All right, any questions from last week? Lingering thoughts, comments? Go for it. Go ahead.
Do you have children? Do you have kids?
I did.
What are their favorite toys?
Oh boy, it was good to toys. Like we ended on toys, we started on toys again. Favorite toys. So I let that out. No, I won't let that one out. I'll just let it go. Just let it go.
Let's jump in.
Any other serious questions? Like Sharpie's 1A, 1B would be good right now.
Do you want a 1A, 1B?
No, not really. Unless you got a good one. Yes, Connor.
This completely related to the topic.
All right.
That was a good question.
I think I'm just going to go ahead and start. All right. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about, now that we sort of got the introduction part out of the way, how we'll do this each time, and then we'll just what we're going to do is we're going to trace certain things going on in the church during the life of the saints, and then certain ways in which the church was formed because of what was going on, because of the intercession or the intervention of the saints, all right? Which sort of leads us to one other point that I wanted to cover last week that we just didn't have time for. And I want us to, some of these things, as we look in hindsight, one of the advantages to not only just reading history, but especially reading church history or the history of the fathers, is it makes us question things that we think are just the way things always have been, or the way they should be, and then what happens is something changes, and we don't recognize it when it changes, and we don't know why things are different. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just having what would be a Catholic vision of history, and understand, because it's very unique, and it's something that the world had for 15 or 16 or 1700 years, and we've now moved away from it. So I want to talk a little bit about why history is really important. You think about how many conversations you have where you have to defend the church against something that happened historically. Right? And then you dig into it a little bit, and you're like, wait a second. That's totally not what happened. And you find out, oh, wait, the Crusades, oh, wait. The church wasn't even the aggressor? Huh? So we've been brought up on these truths, and we've just sort of accepted them because they came from teachers who got them from books. And so we don't necessarily know how to defend the church historically, and then there's a reason why we should do this, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. All right. First of all, we're going to sort of set the stage a little bit. All right. So St. Paul said, "When the fullness of time had come, God sent His Son, born of a woman, born under the law." What does that have to do with anything? Why does He put that in His letter? Anyone know? Why does it matter? Why does that matter? Yes.
Well, I could be wrong here, but is it talking about the fullness of time, the general context of where, why was it good that Jesus came during the time He came in, after Hellenistic spread of culture and Alexander the Great? Basically, it's hoorah over most of the known world. Where
Okay. So keep following that train of thought, though. Keep going. Stay on the track.
Well, okay.
So what does that mean then? If you get stuck, the conclusion's at the bottom.
What?
Everything in history is about Christ. Even the smallest little thing is about Christ. From the very get-go, right? So just back up. So why, as soon as Adam falls, doesn't God just say, okay, here comes the Redeemer, here he comes? Why? Because the time wasn't full yet, right? He had to prep things, right? But that wasn't even his plan B. He had his plan all along, all right? What were you going to say?
Well, in the Galatians quote, he's talking about fullness, in parallel with born and born. It's talking about pregnancy of, time, and, it's basically all of history was gestation of the world, preparing for God.
Yes, and right? Why does God create? Why does He create anything?
It is the nature of love to create.
But why do He create anything? Everything. Everything you see from here for the rest of your life, why is it there?
So we can find Him?
So that you can find God. Everything points to God. Everything points to Christ. All right.
So what does that mean now? Like history now? Because going with his analogy, this is clearly after the pregnancy.
Okay, so hold your question, and we'll go through this a little bit, and then I'll ask it. You'll be able to answer it for everyone else, I think, and when we're done. Yes, Connor.
Could you say at the same time as history made, or all creation made for us to be able to find God, that all was all made for Christ?
Yes, both, right? Both. All right, so let's I'll throw the question in a different direction, and maybe we can get the conversation going. So, why as Christians do we keep the Old Testament? Yes.
Because it's necessary to understand the New Testament.
Yeah. So the typology and all of that. But what else? It gives us a habit, right? A habit of seeing something like a flood, right? That there's a lot of epics that talk about the flood, but only the Bible tells us what it meant. All right, tells us that God was in it and He had a plan with it. All right, and that's the purpose of history, and that's the purpose of the Old Testament, is to show all along God had a plan. All right, and everything that happens, He's revealing Himself more and more and more and more and more. All right, so this idea of history in the ancient world, what they thought was history was just a cycle, never-ending cycle that you could never get out of. Right? Think about that for a second. Right? Think about how empty the world becomes when you do that. Right? We talk about progressives and conservatives. What are we progressing towards, and what are we conserving? It matters which direction we're going, whether we want to go that direction or not. All right. But in the ancient world, it was just, well, if we missed the train this time, it'll just come back around. All right, and it becomes very meaningless. All right. But there's another thing. Jesus came in a very specific time, in a very specific place. And for us to really sort of understand everything we're going to talk about, Christianity is a historical religion. It's the only one that's like that. All right. Obviously, other than Judaism, and to a certain extent, Islam. But all of the other so-called religions of the world, everything that happens outside the world. Right. Think about the different pagan myths; they're all somewhere else. Right? And then something falls down to earth and creates something. But Christianity and Judaism, God comes to earth and writes a story. All right? And then He comes in the fullness of time with good news. Right? An actual, good news isn't that Jesus saved you. That's good. But news is an actual event, right? Like, it's something that happens. I think we lose this with the way we sort of treat news now, right? It's everywhere. But news is like 9/11, a big event, right? Where your life is always going to be different after that. All right. So Christ coming into the world is forever different. Never going to be the same, no matter what. Right? That's news, right? And that's what they were proclaiming. They're saying, look, something happened in that, in this little town of Bethlehem. This person who was clearly more than a man, something happened. Right? And that's what they tell it as a historical event, not as, hey, you know what? We can answer all of your philosophical questions, all of your questions about life with Jesus. No, they pointed to an actual event, right? And if you read all of the speeches in the New Testament, all of the sermons, what are called kerygma, they're all talking about actual historical events, right? Because Jesus is a real person, all right? All right, so that idea, then, to just understand that the fullness of time means that everything was a preparation for that. And even the way that Rome was, right? Like, the Roman Empire was built for Christ, right? The way that the roads were built, the relative peace of the time, all of those things were built for Christ, all right?
Was it like the clay iron feet?
Say that again?
The clay iron feet.
Book of Daniel, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, everything was built. Everything. Everything was for Christ. All right. So the reason why I'm harping on this is because now we have to begin to see everything still the same way. It didn't just stop then. All right? Everything, God is working in every single event to reveal Himself. All right, and we'll talk about some examples in just a minute. All right. So, St. Augustine is sort of the father of a theology of history. Right? And it's in the City of God. He says, Christ is the straight way by which the mind escapes the circular maze of pagan thoughts. Let us follow Christ, our right way, and leave the circular maze of the impious. All right, so he's saying, okay, now history goes in a linear fashion towards something. Right? It has a beginning, a midpoint, and an end. All right, and he's saying that. So, how many of you ever read parts of the City of God? Anybody? All right, so if you read it, you realize that this is exactly what Augustine does. He takes some historical event and interprets it in light of Christ. All right, even the fall of Rome. All right, and so St. Augustine sort of sets up these two competing visions of history. All right, the City of God versus the City of Man. The way we're going to look at history, is it going towards something, or is it going towards God? All right, is it something other than God or towards God? All right, and it's really important because one of them is actually true whether we like it or not. But the other is the vision that is often sort of portrayed to us. All right, so let's talk a little bit about. Does this make sense about sort of maybe making the comparison between the two cities? So there's a push now to get rid of AD, right, and change it with CE. Okay. So by changing AD to CE, have you done anything?
No.
Because all you did was say, okay, from this point, we're not going to talk about what that point actually was, to here, now it's been, 2019 years.
It's still 2019.
From something that was unbelievable that happened, right? Like, the world's totally different. You can't change that by going CE instead of AD, all right? But that's the idea, all right? So what is the sort of modern conception of history then? Well, the modern conception of history is that all history is this sort of conflict, right? It's sort of Hegelian, right? And it can be sort of the communistic one where it's like, rich versus poor, or it can be the sort of modern liberalism where they say, okay, this is just, all of history has just been this battle for freedom, all right? And what's the problem with those two sort of narratives? Yes?
They still place history and ownership of man rather than that something that's like God related.
Yeah, but are they circular or are they linear?
Well, no, it's a cycle.
Yeah, because in that, where are we going? We're not going anywhere, right? Like, what are we progressing towards?
The new synthesis.
Yeah, we're just like somehow those two things, the thesis and the antithesis, going to get together and they're going to synthesize, and then we're going to have this utopia on Earth, right?
I got lost somewhere.
You got lost?
Yeah, I don't.
Well, I was sort of finishing his thoughts.
There's too many big words floating around.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So let's just back up a little bit then. So, all right. So when we read history, all right, are we just getting a bunch of facts? No. Facts always have interpretations with them. Right? So is there any such thing as an unbiased account of history?
No.
Everyone agree that that's not possible, right? That you can't just report facts. There's always going to be an interpretation like this is a lot of what we talked about last week, right? Like there's always going to be an interpretation attached to them.
History is made by the victors.
Yeah, that's a realistic, sort of understanding. So why then, when we talk about that trace of history, and we talk about this battle between two sides, where who has become the enemy? The church, right? Does everyone sort of get that feeling from history? Mm-hmm. Like we talked about already about defending, right? Defending the church. Well, the church has become the enemy, right? Rather than the one guiding history, which is the truth. Okay? All right, so let me just sort of now pull this back together. All right. Maybe do it this way, and then we can sort of, I'm going to skip that one. All right, I can see that I kind of lost you guys for a second, so I will try to reel you back in. All right, so Warren Carroll was a historian. He started Christendom College And he set out to write a history of Christendom. What's Christendom, by the way?
Christ's kingdom.
Christ's kingdom where? So when we talk about like the Middle Ages, like we talk about Christendom, what does that mean? And do we still live in Christendom?
Well, in the Middle Ages, it would mean the Holy Roman Empire or
Papal states.
Okay, does it have to have that?
No, I think it means it's all of the states who accepted Christianity as their state religion.
All right, so anyone want to sort of challenge that? Go ahead.
Christ's kingdom like lasts from the time creation was made till the time second coming.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain element of that, right? So if we were to, let's flip this around. So if America was to become part of Christendom, what would have to change?
The people, not the laws or anything else.
Well, sort of.
the core principles on which the state is built, perhaps.
And what's the core principle? What'd you say, Andrew?
Because you said founded, but also continually run on.
Yeah. So Christendom just simply means the church and the state had the same goal, and the goal was salvation of the members of society. All right, that's all it was. So, like, the king cared about the salvation of his subjects first and foremost. All right, and then everything in his kingdom was ordered towards that. Okay. Casey, you look puzzled.
I just feel like any empire or kingdom, oftentimes the king is not necessarily focused on the salvation of.
So this is Augustine's argument, right? City of God versus city of man. So the city of God, the sort of manifestation of Christ's kingdom on earth, the laws, the structure of society, all geared towards the salvation of the members of society, right? And so when we're looking at our own country, that's our goal. Our goal is to structure society so that it makes it easy for someone to be saved. Right? And I think we all sort of agree that that's not the case. All right. So that idea then of what makes Christendom. All right. So Warren Carroll comes up with these principles about how a Catholic should study history. All right. And hopefully, with some examples, we can make this make sense. So throughout history, if we go into it with our bias that only natural things can happen, is that a good way to look at history?
No.
Shake your heads no. Why?
You're pre-imposing a materialist worldview on
Yes.
history.
Okay, so you're pre-imposing a materialist worldview on history, right? But what happens when you do that?
You miss the thing.
You eliminate it, right? So, how many of you know that Rasputin died 11 times? You know who Rasputin is? Everyone know who Rasputin is? So Rasputin is he was a mind bender of the czars of Russia in the early 1900s, and he was sort of the precursor of leading Russia into a revolution. Okay, and clearly possessed, and in fact so clearly possessed that he died 11 times. They shot him 3 times. They poisoned him. Well, let me get the order right, because hold on. They poisoned him, shot him 3 times, hit him beat him over the head, and at this point, no blood is coming out of his head, which tells us what.
This was like right after each other?
Yes, all in the same night. He died 11 times in the same night. So, not to be gruesome, but if you're hitting someone in the head and they're not bleeding, their heart's not beating, right? Should tell you something, right? They threw him in the frozen river. Then they fished him out. Then I think they strangled him. I may get the order wrong because 11 is a lot. But nevertheless, if you have a minute, go look it up. All right? The problem is you don't hear about this. Why? Because there's no natural explanation for that. Unless you then look at history and go, ooh, look at what happened to Russia right after that. Within a month, Lenin was on a train, hidden on his way to Russia. Okay? But a month before, an angel appeared to some children in Fatima, Portugal. Right? And a few months later, Our Lady appears, and what does she say? Tells these children, I don't even know where Russia is. Right? She gives them a message about Russia. Right. And then, fast forward, 70 years, and the wall falls because of this pope who was Polish, who happened to be consecrated to that same lady that showed up in that little field in Portugal. And history would never be the same. All right? Now, does the communist revolution or anything make sense if we try to pull those things out? Pull those supernatural occurrences out? Not really, right? We're just looking at it as an episode, right? Think about the way we're taught history is episode, right?
It's all separate vignettes.
Yes.
Tied together.
Yep. Because what's the thread that's tying them all together? God's providence, right? This is the important part. Hopefully this is now making it a little clearer where we're trying to go with this. All right? God's providence ties each of those episodes together. All right? So we go, all right, communism, Cold War, end of Cold War now. And that's how we teach it. Okay? And we go, up and down. But that wasn't the way God designed it, right? Because woven all through that is the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. Because God wants to show us His mother, right? All right, so that's the idea. Just understanding that God is working in history, even in messes and muck. All right? And which, by the way, like John Paul II, even if you go a little deeper, is sort of like the anti-Rasputin, right? He gets shot in the heart. Bullet stops an inch from his heart because somebody guided the bullet, and then he ends up ending communism. So again, God is working in every event. All right, so that's the idea. Just understanding supernatural events happen all the time. Okay? And you cannot understand history without it. And when we begin to talk about the Church Fathers, we're going to see a lot of that. All right? We're going to see a lot of these sort of coincidences. Yes?
But how in historical study, like what you're saying makes sense because a myriad of different reasons. One, like, okay, those would all be very strange if they all happened coincidentally. And Occam's razor, like the most reasonable thing, we should believe it, I suppose. But how do you discern between this being a supernatural event and this being false history? Not necessarily this example.
Yeah, you have to see the connection, right? So it's not. Remember, I didn't really take an event. I connected all the events because they are connected.
Yeah.
But you're also looking for connection, though.
No, of course you are, because I think history has a meaning, right? I've already a priori decided. Yeah, I've already decided that history does that God, in the fullness of time, Christ came, and history was forever changed. So I'm totally biased. You should admit you're biased, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong, right?
So this would presuppose already having looked at these events and determined they're fairly historically reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not just making up, these things, right? I'm tracing them, seeing God's plan from here, looking back, going, okay, this all begins to make sense, right? So this is one of the reasons why Warren Carroll started Christendom College, by the way, because he wanted to raise whole generations of people who could actually think like this. Right? And if you read he has a 6-volume set on Christendom where he does this, and he does it really well, where he sort of traces events, right? And I think Stephen, you already mentioned this once, but these books they're worth reading. I mean, obviously 6 volumes, 500 something pages a piece, at least. It's not something you're going to get through before we meet next week or 2 weeks.
Attitude.
Water pretty fast.
But anyway, that's the point. He goes through and does that. All right.
Are you just sending me a booklet?
Yes.
The other part that he talks about, his other principle, is seeing all history as religious and political. Seeing how this is what I think is really difficult for people of our age because they see everything as economic. Everything's driven by economic forces. But historically, that's not really the case. Everything is driven by religion. Right? This is why somebody cannot fathom why Muslims do what they do when there's a suicide bombing. They can't imagine, why would you do that for God? They can't imagine having zeal for something like that. Right? And so it becomes a total puzzle to them. And then what do? They try to explain it by saying, well, it's just because they're really poor, and and they've been brainwashed, or they're whatever.
Who was it? Was it Bill Nye, the science guy, that said that droughts are the reason why? He said something that's like some environmental.
Wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me. Droughts in the desert are rough. Were you going to say something? Okay. All right. The third sort of goes with this, just acknowledging that throughout history, the Church and the Pope have been prime actors, right? Because God works in and through the Church, right? And the example of John Paul II is, you could do that many other times throughout history, all right?
And it's funny because even I don't know, it's very popular for the American media to make fun of the Catholic Church, but yet the Pope comes over and everyone's respecting him and listening to him and going, he said this, ah!
Yeah, every single word, right? His fourth is to see history through the eyes of saints rather than through the eyes of scoundrels. Right? So he says rather than, looking at the French Revolution through the eyes of someone like Robespierre, look at it through the martyrs. Or look at it through, St. John Vianney. Or look at... So he said, he takes certain events and he says, okay, let's look at what because the saints are always hanging around when there's big things going on. All right? That's why they're saints. And we don't always catch that, right? I mean, think about Joan of Arc, right? Like this little peasant girl changes the 100 Years' War.
Oh my gosh!
Knows nothing about warfare.
We just talked about this in RCIA.
Yeah, has these revelations and changes history.
What is going on?
And then the fifth that we've already talked about is just eliminate bias. Not in the sense of not having bias, because we all have some sort of bias, but in the sense of don't try to defend the church for some of the things that have happened, right?
Don't try.
I mean, some of the things that just you can't defend them, right?
The church is messed up.
Yeah. Just understand, a lot of people do that. A lot of people try to find, they often use the, well, you did this argument, where you say, someone will say you did something wrong, and they'll go, well, it's not as bad as this. Well, no, just accept that, you know what? Very often, Christians don't live up to Christian standards. Mm-hmm. And that's not okay, but that's reality, and that's what happens. Okay? Because some of the things there's some aspects of Catholic history that you can't defend. You can't defend some of the horrible popes we've had, no matter how hard you try. You can then turn around and go, hey, look, if anything else had leaders like that, be pretty screwed up by now, and we're still here 2,000 years later. But just accept that, that's the mystery of the church, is that there's these human elements that screw up sometimes. All right. So this is all now makes sense. Did I give you guys too much all at one time? Here is what I would say is a reading list, just for your own sort of ones that I would recommend. St. Augustine, City of God. Eusebius, his church history, wrote in the 4th century. We already talked about John Henry Newman, and then sort of more closer to our time in the last 100 years, Henri Daniel Ropes. Anything he wrote, pretty much, he went almost all the way through history. He's almost as prolific as Warren Carroll as far as that's concerned. Christopher Dawson, who was an English convert mostly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, who came to Harvard. And then Warren Carroll, and then Rodney Stark is I think he's actually a sociologist by trade, but he writes really good history defending the church, and he's not Catholic, and I think he's agnostic actually, but he has some of the best defenses of the church historically, and I still to this day can't figure out why he does it. And why he does, and he'll talk about supernatural aspects of it, everything, but for whatever reason, it's just not his cup of tea, I guess. It's just a little puzzling, but he's definitely worth reading.
Is he alive?
Yeah. He's a professor at Baylor, I think.
That's so weird.
Anything particular of his that you'd recommend?
I mean, any of For the Glory of God is good. He has one on the Reformation that he just wrote. He has one on the Crusades. but he's pretty fair. I mean, he will, he'll ding the church where they need to be dinged, and that's the advantage of someone who wants the truth. He doesn't try to whitewash some of the stuff that the church did.
Maybe God's just waiting for him to finish that, and then he'll bring him into the church.
Made us the mystery of like C.S. Lewis too, right? Like why is, C.S. Lewis never became, well, he's Catholic now, or he's not, but he never became Catholic. All right, so let's sort of get back to, yes, Andrew.
Real quick, is Warren Carroll still alive?
No, he died maybe 2005.
Trying to set up interviews or
No, it's a little bit later. Maybe it was like 2010. But if you go, the Christendom has all of his talks and podcasts too. If you just go on iTunes and search Christendom. All right, that was a sort of a long diversion. I didn't mean to get that long, but all right. So everybody's sort of on the same page with how we sort of read history. We good? Okay. All right. So let's dive back into St. Paul. All right, and we're going to start with his conversion. We all sort of know this, right? We know the story on his journey. He was near Damascus. Light fell from the sky, fell to the ground, and then he hears a voice: "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you, sir?" And I think that really should be Lord, by the way, but I did use the New American Bible.
Sir in the Mass.
Yeah, that's why I always use that. But anyway, the reply came, "I am Jesus whom you were persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, for they heard the voice but could see no one. Saul got up from the ground. When he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. All right, so you guys know Friday we just celebrated the Feast of the Conversion. So I want to talk about just what it means for St. Paul to have converted, though, in the sense, because we often look at a conversion, right, as this sort of change of mind, or this sort of like almost like a psychological process, right? Like where you sort of just go, oh, yeah, now I understand. But I want us to sort of understand two things about it. First, he converts because he has an encounter with Christ, right? The person of Christ. He didn't suddenly just like read the Bible and go, oh wait, I think this part, I think those Christians are right. He meets Christ face to face, right? In fact, he meets Christ face to face, and it's so bright it blinds him. Right? So he's given all of this, like that experience of not darkness but light. He gets so much light that it blinds him. All right. But the other point that I really want us to talk about, because this is the part we don't really understand, because we call it a conversion. After this, does he still consider himself a Jew?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? And so if we're going to understand anything about Catholicism, we're going to have to understand something about Judaism the way that the early church did. All right? And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about, all right? So in a sense, and this is what Benedict XVI said when he did a whole bunch of Wednesday audiences on St. Paul, he said, in a real sense, it's not really a conversion, but it's a death and a resurrection. Right, so he literally shares in Christ's death and resurrection, and then does so sacramentally after, and that's when the scales come off, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about his relationship with the Jews and why us understanding Judaism is really important. All right, so the very first thing that he does is what? After he's baptized, he goes into the synagogue, right, to teach. All right, so he didn't go out in the streets; he went into the synagogue. All right, and what was he going to find in the synagogue? Jews, right? All right, so he still considered himself a Jew, and in fact, that's what Christians did. They went into the temple. You see this in Acts of the Apostles. They went into the synagogue. So they still considered themselves Jews. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Judaism at the time of Christ and at the time of St. Paul. All right, so there's probably about a tenth of the Roman Empire was Jewish. So there's about 9 million of them. But most of them didn't live in Jerusalem. All right, so if you sort of remember your Jewish history, they're spread out. It's called the diaspora, right? So they're everywhere. All right? And then because they're everywhere, right, Judaism centers around the temple. Right? And people would come to the temple for sacrifices. But because everyone's so far away, they start this system of synagogues. All right? Does everyone know what a synagogue is? So synagogue is just where they would meet, and think of it as synagogue is like liturgy of the word temple is like liturgy of the Eucharist. All right, so they would go and it would be sort of like today's gospel, right? Christ goes into the synagogue, something's read, the rabbi teaches, and they disperse. Okay, they have some more prayers and all that. All right, so they begin. They're all over the empire, right? And they're usually in pockets of people because they've been scattered. And there's pockets of people, and where there's larger pockets of people, they start synagogues. All right, and so they meet. But the other thing is to understand that Judaism wasn't this sort of monolithic thing. All right, when you talked about Judaism in the first century, you'd be talking about 5, 6, 7 different groups. All right, and we see them in the gospel. Right, we see the Sadducees, who were more politically Jewish, and they don't believe in things like resurrection of the dead. They only believe in the first 5 books of the Torah, or the five books of the law. And then you have the Pharisees, who were studiers of the law. They're the ones that Christ sort of bumps heads with a lot, right? But they're also the group from which the most converts come. Okay. And of which Paul was too. And then you have smaller groups like the Essenes, which some people think John the Baptist was an Essene. The Essenes are the ones where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they lived this sort of ascetic life out in the wilderness, sort of like early monks. And then you had the Zealots, who were sort of violently opposed to anyone interfering with anything going on in Jerusalem. Or in Israel specifically, yes.
Were these fairly family? Like if your father was a Pharisee, would you be Pharisee? Or more like denominations where if your father's Presbyterian, you could still be Catholic?
Yeah, chances are it was more like that. I mean, would they go from being like Sadducees to Pharisees? I don't know. I hadn't really ever thought about that.
It's more like guilds in a way?
No, they're not really, because they have a whole separate sort of sense of belief about different things. Like, they're not just looking at, some of the things are like, there's a big difference between believing in the resurrection and not, right? And, yes?
What would Jesus have been in? Like, if, I've heard he was more akin to the Pharisees.
Yeah, he would have been more of a Pharisee, I think. Yes. Go ahead, Sean.
What is that based off of? Like,
just his ritual practices, the things that he did. I would think he would be more inclined towards that, although it'd be hard to say, I guess. Yes, Andrew, what were you going to ask?
2 things. One, did you mention scribes?
No, so the scribes were, I think, a part of the Pharisees. So they were what scribes? They were basically like sort of like canon lawyers, like would be sort of similar to what they were. They were more concerned with the law and its application. All right.
And then,
yes.
One more thing. Was there any overlap between these groups, like with a zealot and a Pharisee? Because what would a zealot actually just do? Like in every
so yes and no. So there were times when it was expedient they would. So like the Sadducees and the Pharisees finally come together and are like, okay, Christ's got to go, right? But then it's the Zealots who actually cause the Roman Empire to come in and destroy the temple because they decide that they've had enough. So the Romans come into Jerusalem and they instigate what ultimately ends up being the destruction of the temple.
Are you talking about like in like the 80, 70?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you would never see someone who is a Pharisee but also would be a zealot.
No, probably not. Probably not, because the Pharisees were the name means I think untouchable. So they actually tried to stay away from every other Jew, but would only sort of cooperate with the other ones. And then there's also the Samaritans, which we sort of know the story of the Samaritans. Like they were the hate, all of them, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
But Samaritans were Jewish?
Samaritans were also Jews, right? But they were in Samaria, but they didn't go to the temple, right? They thought they were going to build their own temple. That's why Jesus has the conversation he does with the Samaritan woman at the well when she says, your people say that, we have to go to Jerusalem to worship. Right. Well, our people say this, right? And so she's trying to pull him into this abstract sort of theological argument, right? And he just basically says, well, you're both wrong. But the other part, too, to sort of understand, like each one of those groups then had a different idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be. All right, so we tend to generalize. We're like, oh, it's a political Messiah. Not really. Certainly for the Zealots, it was a political Messiah, right? They were looking for another Judas Maccabeus. But the Pharisees were looking for something different. Okay, and so were the Essenes, and so were the Samaritans. All right, so there's no. This is, we often go like, okay, all the signs are in the Old Testament. Why didn't they grasp it? Well, because they all had different ideas. There's not a book that said, okay, here's the checklist of when you see the Messiah. All right, if he has these things, then this is it. All right, they all just thought there would be this, whatever it was, would be this time of Israel's glory, and God's justice would rule the world. Now, would it rule it through the Jews? Some of them said yes, some of them said no, whatever. Okay, all right. So that's sort of what Judaism looks like. All right, so let's put Judaism in the context then of ancient religions. All right, so ancient times were more religious by far than ours are now. Okay, but in a very different way. So throughout the Roman Empire, every place had their own gods, their own local gods. All right, and so religion became is a very social thing that bound those people together in that place. All right, so it was almost sort of made out of necessity. So we're in this place. We know about. We have this sense of the numinous, the sense of something supernatural that we probably owe some homage to. And they would some cult would rise up. Okay, and so they each had their own sort of pantheon of gods. All right, which is the exact opposite of how Judaism was formed. Right. Judaism doesn't start in one place, per se. They carry their God around with them. All right? If a Roman moved from a town to a town, they wouldn't carry their God with them. All right? Because their God wouldn't have a temple there. Yes, Connor?
Was that word you used, numinous?
Yeah, numinous just means like this sense of something, like the room is haunted kind of feeling. Like the sense of something else is here besides just me.
Yeah. Lots of numen is like the spirit of a god.
Yeah. All right. So religion was something that brought the people together, whereas for ancient Israel, this is what makes it sort of unique, right? Is that there's this diaspora, and the people are keeping their faith and starting synagogues there, right? So this idea, then, you can already see if we look at history through the lens of God forming the Catholic Church, what does that already look like? The seeds of the church, right? Like, think about, like, the church isn't in one country, although it has, it has local churches, sort of like the Jews have their local synagogues. But it's not just, it just doesn't form in one country and then that's it when people leave, all right? So these pagan, there's a consequence of that, though, right? The consequence is, if you don't honor the God, what does that make you?
An outsider?
Not just an outsider, but a threat to society, right? Because you're doing something that breaks society up. All right, so if you don't pay homage to the local God, the God may get really angry and threaten. In fact, if you read City of God, that's what they accuse the Christians of making the Roman gods angry. And Augustine comes back and says, well, that's absurd. But nevertheless, you're seen as a threat, okay? And this is important when we begin to talk about why the church is persecuted, all right? And so they have these local gods, and okay, so the Romans come in, and they're like, okay, you can keep your gods, but the only thing you're going to have to add to it is our God, all right? And at a certain point, the God becomes what's called the genius, or the spirit of the emperor. So they're like, look, you can keep your gods, it's fine, but you're going to need to, every so often, give a pinch of incense to the genius of the emperor to show that you're aligned with Rome. All right? And so anyone who didn't do this was considered a sort of a political rebel and would be put to death. All right? Except the Jews. All right? The Jews got a pass. And just sort of politically, historically, one of the Herods did Julius Caesar a favor, and he gave them in perpetuity a pass. So he said, you can't convert anyone, keep to yourselves, you'll be fine, you don't need to offer sacrifices, because he knew that they only believed there was one God and they couldn't offer sacrifice to other gods, and he gave them a pass. All right. So the other thing too, because there was sort of a form of ancestor worship, they only believed the religions that were old were valid, because they thought the people that came before were more pious than the people that came after. All right, and so the gods of their ancestors were the true gods. All right, and so they had a disdain for new religions. All right. All right. Any questions on that?
The Jews did?
No, the Romans.
The Romans.
Yeah. Yeah, the Jews had a disdain for any religion, but Jews. All right. So the Jews are then unique because they have the one God, but Caesar gives them a pass. And the Romans could have hundreds of gods because they thought they're all just the same, they're just different manifestations of them. This ought to sort of ring a bell, by the way. This is where you're sort of creeping back towards paganism when people are saying things like that, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about then what happened with the Jews and the Christians. And so Christians move in, right? And because they appear to be just like the Jews, they too first get a pass. All right. So very early on, they get a pass, and they don't have to offer sacrifices. But then in Rome, there's this argument, and it's getting to be a little out of control. And so the Emperor Claudius throws all the Jews out of Rome. All right, and this is in about the year 40. And if you read Roman history, the Roman historian Suetonius said, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, that's just Christ, he expelled them from Rome. He's talking about Claudius. All right. So this is during Nero's reign. During his reign, many abuses were severely punished and put down, and no fewer new laws were made. A limit was set to expenditures. The public banquets were confined to a distribution of food. The sale of any kind of cooked viands in the taverns was forbidden, in the exception of pulse and vegetables, whereas before every sort of dainty was exposed for sale. Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. All right, so we see this is, again, sort of what's going on historically. At a certain point, they now realize that the Christians are different than the Jews. All right, and not just because they're arguing, and not because they know their beliefs, but because the Jews are starting to turn on them. All right, and so what does Nero do? Well, there's the big fire in Rome, blames it conveniently on the Christians, and for the first time in history, Christians are singled out, and their religion is made illegal. All right, because there's no new religions. They won't offer sacrifices to gods, so they're seen as a public threat. And Rome had this thing about meeting in private. Okay? They thought there could be no private associations. And these people were meeting in private, and there were all kind of rumors about cannibalism, because they eat the body and blood of this person. They call each other brother and sister, and so we think there may be some incest going on. But they're meeting, and they won't let other people come in and watch. And so we begin to see, and then of course the Jews all along are instigating it, right? They're going, yeah, that and more. Yes.
In regards to the burning of Rome, I think that one of the reasons that Nero had valid reason for blaming it on them is because there were a lot of, I think he said that they were celebrating in the streets and such, and I think that historically some have argued that that's because many of the Christians at the time thought it was the burning of Rome was a second coming already. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of like theories and things going, but the fire started to be fair, in the poor part of Rome, because that's the part that Nero wanted to take over, which also happened to be the place where the Christians lived. So somehow they started a fire in their own homes to burn the city of Rome. But yeah, there's all kinds of sort of theories surrounding that. But anyway, at that point,
it's now the Romans have singled the Christians out. All right. And so, all right. So this is the sort of what now that becomes the obstacle. Okay. So now they can't just go. They can't just go into the synagogue and preach to the Jews. And they can't just go into the streets because it's illegal. And so there seems to be this sort of this block, right? And so let's talk a little bit about how St. Paul then becomes instrumental in spreading Christianity. Right, so you often hear about him being the apostle to the Gentiles. All right, how many apostles are there?
13.
There's 13, right? So why 13?
Because isn't it Matthias after Judas?
Yeah, so Matthias became the 12th, but why is there 13? What is the symbolism of 13?
Okay, so there were 12 for the 12 tribes, right? And then the 13th was everyone else.
13th was for the Gentiles, right? So this idea of grafting on to Israel, all right, this is why we begin to now see why it's important to see the church as just a continuation of Israel, okay? So that all the promises to Israel now go to the church. Right, so there's no difference in Paul's mind between Judaism and Catholicism. All right, he's just saying, okay, well, all of the stuff that was in Judaism has been fulfilled. We're still Jews. Okay, and remember we talked last week about the arguments they have. Right? Okay, well, what does that exactly mean? What things do we still do? What things don't we do? Do we still circumcise? Do we not? Right. So all of those things become important. But nevertheless. It just becomes a continuation because God is a father trying to form a family, right? And he's now pulling everyone into it. And this idea, this is a very distinctly sort of Catholic idea, okay? That, sort of Judaism finds its fulfillment in Catholicism and not just in Christianity, all right? For most non-Catholic Christians, there's this abrupt sort of break, all right? And then he's done with the Jews, and now he's moved to the Christians, and that isn't at all the way God looks at it. Right? He's continuing his plan. Right? It's a linear plan. All right. So yes,
it's kind of off topic, but I've heard some Jews, and I'm not very well associated with Orthodox Judaism, but some Reformed Jews who refer to Jesus as a prophet. And I'm really confused by that, honestly, how they think Jesus could be a prophet with anything that he said.
Yeah, I think that, so let me just back up and then I can maybe try to address the question. So, Judaism today is completely different from Judaism then, right? Because at the heart of all those things that united those Jews together was sacrifice. Having even the Samaritans thought you still had to perform sacrifices. They said, okay, not in Jerusalem, we can do it here. But at the heart of it is the temple and to have a sacrifice, all right? And once the temple is destroyed, Judaism is completely changed, all right? And so it becomes almost a different religion. So at a certain point, say after the second time they encounter the Romans in like the year 130 and they're put down again, the decision becomes, what is Judaism now, right? Is it this thing that's going off in this direction where they don't have a temple, they just meet in synagogues, it's very rabbinic, it's just about the rabbis, or is it this new thing that seems to have grafted onto it and has become the Catholic Church, right? So there's this split. Either way, there was going to be a split, all right? And so later on when people attack the church, especially when Greek philosophers begin to attack the church, especially ones like Julian the Apostate is a great example. He's a Roman emperor who was raised as a Christian, but he became a pagan after he became emperor, and because he really knew the scriptures, and he said, "Oh, these people aren't Christians. Whatever this Christianity is a bunch of crap because they don't follow the Old Testament. They're not doing these things, right?" And in fact, if you sort of read history, he tried to rebuild the temple. And then, does anyone know this is really, again, supernatural. Anyone know the story of Julian rebuilding the temple? So he tries to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and fire is coming up out of the ground and consuming the workers as they're doing it. People are getting struck by lightning, and he just finally just gives up. He's like, I can't, there's no way I can do this, right? But he had this just hatred for Christians.
Well, it's because everyone at the time, whether you were Christian, Jewish, or Aryan, knew that if Jew and the apostate succeeded, then it obviously meant that Christianity was a false religion.
Exactly. Like, you got to hear what he says, really important, right? Because that's what they tried to show. So, okay, Judaism survives, then Christianity has no purpose. So back to your point, like, I don't know about like the different sects now, what they actually believe in. And I'm always puzzled by the way they try to connect it to Jesus too. So, I mean, he never claimed to be a prophet, so I'm not really sure why someone else would make that claim. But he was a prophet, but he was way more than a prophet, right?
I actually had an interesting discussion with a Jewish friend a few days ago about this, and I can explain afterwards if you'd like.
All right. So that's where sort of Judaism is. All right. So at a certain point, then, all right. So Paul crosses over into Europe. Right. He goes into Macedonia, then he goes to Philippi, and then he goes to Ephesus, and then he goes down into Athens. All right. And Athens is sort of like the intellectual capital of the Roman Empire. All right. And you guys sort of know the story of when he encounters in the Areopagus. I want to read this because I want to help sort of understand what he's doing here. So notice again where he starts out. He starts out in the synagogue, right? And again, understanding the whole history, what was the purpose of the Jews forming the synagogues? Read it like a Catholic. Why did the Jews form the synagogues?
These are like modern day parishes?
So that Catholicism could spread. So that when Paul was ready, he had a place to go. All right, that's why. All right, so everything in Judaism prepared the way for Catholicism. All right, so he starts in the synagogue with the Jews and with the worshipers. You often see things like God-fearers. You guys ever seen that? So a God-fearer is just a Gentile who believes Judaism is true but really doesn't want to be circumcised, more or less. I mean, that's a way oversimplification, but they're essentially Jews without circumcision. And daily in a public square with whoever happened to be there, even some of the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion. Some asked, what is this scavenger trying to say? Others said he sounds like a promoter of foreign deities. You see that they're a little suspect of him talking about other gods, because nobody took their gods to a place and talked about them, right? Because he was preaching about Jesus and resurrection. And I don't know if you ever caught this. So they think that they're two different gods. Jesus is one and resurrection is the other.
That's funny.
They took him and led him to the Areopagus and said, may we learn what this new teaching is that you speak of. Then Paul stood up in the Areopagus and said, you Athenians, I see that in every respect you are very religious. First I walked around looking carefully at your shrines. I even discovered an altar inscribed to an unknown God. What therefore you unknowingly worship, I proclaim to you. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your poets have said. So notice how he's trying to relate to them on their level, right? For we too are his offspring. Since therefore we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divinity is like an image fashioned from gold, silver, or stone by human art and imagination. God has overlooked the times of ignorance, but now he demands that all people everywhere repent, because he has established a day on which he will judge the world with justice through a man he has appointed, and he has provided confirmation for all by raising him from the dead. When they heard about resurrection of the dead, some began to scoff, but others said, we should like to hear you about this another time.
I love understatement.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about, and it'll help us understand how Christianity spread and even how it can spread now. So why is it that the Stoics and the Epicureans show the most interest? Does anyone know? Andrew, go ahead.
Well, I might be confusing them with the Platonists, but the Stoics are in some ways, they're almost monotheistic, aren't they? I mean,
yeah, and so Stoics are. They do have, like, they're close to Platonists, but their emphasis is really on virtue. Right? They're really concerned with virtue, and for them, Christianity becomes a puzzle because they're like, these people are really virtuous. Why are they so virtuous? And we can't do it. Like, their philosophy. So remember, for the Greeks, they think the whole problem is not in the will. The whole problem is knowledge. If I just know what's good, I can do it. All right, and so what happens is they're like, okay, these people must have some secret philosophy that makes them more virtuous than us. So they're intrigued by it, right? And then the people they battle with are the Epicureans, and they just believe they're materialists, and that everything is based on the pleasure principle. And so when they hear something about resurrection from the dead, they're like, how is that possible? All right, so what St. Paul is saying is he's saying, okay, you all have been prepared for this, right? But what's their response? No, we haven't, right? They're saying, well, actually, we don't. We don't. And so what does this show? This shows, okay, it's not enough to have the correct philosophy. You need grace, right? So they're waiting for the infusion of grace. But they're also waiting for a correct philosophy, right? Remember last week we talked about that uniting, I think it was actually on the slide I skipped, that John Henry Newman talks about how Athens and Rome come together in Catholicism, as it's the only true religion and the only true philosophy, right? And because their philosophy had errors in it, their worldview had errors in it, they couldn't accept it, right? Someone who's completely and totally a materialist, how do you speak to them about the resurrection of the body? How do you speak to them of the soul? All right. And so St. Paul realizes, he's like, okay, this is going to require some work, some prayer, some fasting for grace. But he was going to have them move in a different direction, right? To even just understand the foundations of the truth. All right. And so what does he do? Well, so after this, I didn't include it as a slide. So after this, he feels like a total failure, and so he goes off to Corinth. All right, and he's there, and he meets a couple of Christians. And notice again the historicity of this. All right, and we can even tell. So there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Remember earlier in the slide what I showed you? Right, when he was talking about Crestus? So the historical sort of accuracy of understanding, this is how we can piece it together. And he went to visit them, and because he practiced the same trade, stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Yes?
What version of the Bible is that from? Because it refers to it as Italy?
Yeah, this is all the. I always pull out the New American Bible just so that when it's doesn't matter. I don't particularly. We talked about it before. I don't really like that as a translation. But yeah, there was no such thing as Italy. I don't know why it's translated.
So do you happen to know what they called it in another?
No, I never really looked. Yeah. So anyway, so notice what we think about. Well, okay, well, Paul had this job, right? He's this apostle, but he's working, right? He's a tent maker, and you would think, okay, well, that makes it just easier for him to preach the gospel because he meets more people. Except workers were really looked down upon, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about life in Rome and see how Christianity flipped everything over. All right, so nobody worked in Rome. Okay, the slaves did all the work. Even freedmen that were poor, they didn't work either because there was no work to be done. Right, it was all doled out to the slaves, so they just lived off of the grain that they were provided by the government, and then the patricians and the plebeians. Patricians hated the plebeians because they were living off of. Again, off to start ringing bells. Hated the fact that they were living off of the fruit of their money. And so what the emperors did, well, they were like, okay, we got to keep them happy. And we have this whole class of people that has nothing to do. So what are we going to do?
Bread and circuses.
Bread and circuses, right? This is where it comes from, right? So it's like, okay, let's form the circuses. Let's have gladiatorial, right? Let's keep them entertained. All right? And it becomes a very depraved culture because of that. Right? So you have a whole a whole group of people that has nothing to do but stir up trouble. And again, this ought to sort of, yes?
You could draw parallels to that, like the modern Middle East today.
You could draw parallels to it, to Eastern North Carolina, like anywhere. Any piece, right? Yeah, no, I agree. More so we're in the Middle East, but in America, it's the same way, right? One of the best ways to keep people focused on the here and now is the bread and circumcision effect, right? And so, so workers were really looked down upon, right? So St. Paul being a tent maker was not glorious at all. But the important part is for us to just grasp, to think about, okay, that's the culture that they came into, right? Where workers, would anyone think that now?
What do you mean?
The workers are somehow less than human, or people who work? Some do, but for the most part, the people, like when you guys go and get jobs, is the world going to look down upon you?
Depends what job.
Well, there is that. There is that.
I feel like the job is, instead of being depressed, it's like elevated too high these days.
Okay, but definitely, for the most part, we're not going to say someone's going to. You're working. That, right? Like ultimately.
I mean, there are those ads on YouTube that tell you how to be like a millionaire real quick.
Yeah, there are those, I guess.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, how did we get from there to here, where we now say, oh, yeah, everyone works, and in fact, the people who, even the upper class works, they have upper class jobs, right? Like, nobody scoffs at a white collar worker because they're working, right?
Because Christianity accepted the dignity of all laborers.
Because Christ changed the world. Right? How did he change the world? He came as a worker. He sent this guy out as a worker.
Carpenter.
Well, technically, so Christ was not a carpenter. There was no wood in Nazareth. He was a stone worker called a tecton. All right, which is again beautiful, right? So it becomes, guess what stones he worked on? Our hearts, our stony hearts, right? And he built them into something else. It's beautiful, right? I don't know how I have a wooden heart.
Why do we have this?
I don't know why we present it as a carpenter. Like,
Isn't that whole thing about like it really is like construction worker? Or is it
huh?
whatever that word was?
I think it's just I think maybe it's a translation. I don't know why he's always been called a carpenter.
Translating is really hard.
Yeah. Huh? No, Joseph was a stone worker too.
Wait.
Like if you read it, he was called a tecton.
Wait,
Yes.
why do we?
General term for
Yeah. I mean, carpenter could be a general word, I guess. Like, I wouldn't get like totally like, don't let this send you down a spiral. Like, not a big deal.
But what
Not a
about
big
that
deal.
miraculous staircase?
But again, historically, everything Christ did had a meaning to it, right? So he came to take our stony hearts and build something else out of them. All right,
He is
so
also the cornerstone.
there's that too. There's that too.
Lightning.
Not the floor joist, the cornerstone. But so part of what we're going to talk about in the next few slides is just how much Christianity changed the world, and how if we're not careful, we're going to go backwards. All right. Why is any work good?
Because Jesus worked.
Well, yeah, Jesus sanctified it, but because it's a human being doing it, right? And yes, Christ sanctified it. So, is being a janitor a bad thing?
No.
No.
No, right? Like, that's what human beings do, right? And in fact, the work itself, that Christ showed, the outside work doesn't matter. Like, what you produce doesn't matter. It's what it turns you into, right? So, Paul was doing that, working night and day, and growing in virtue while he's doing it. He's becoming holier because of that, right? And that's totally flipping the idea of work. It's not about production. It's about what it turns him into. And that's really important for us to grasp now, because now we're moving away from that, right? We're moving towards more on the product rather than the producer, right? And Christianity and everyone in the world wants it to focus on the producer. Like every worker goes, I want it to be about what it's doing to me. Like if this work isn't changing me, turning me into something better, this isn't what God called me to. Right? And everyone wants that. Go ahead, Casey.
So did the Jewish community also have, or different parts of the Jewish community also have the looking down on workers thing?
Not as much.
So like,
not as much. So you see seeds of what the Christians believed, right? You might see where they got a little infected with the spirit of the world, but they would also remember the creation story. They would know, oh yeah, work is one of the ways that we image God. And so they would think work was a good thing. They would probably think some things were beneath them. But when they talk about Jesus being Joseph's son, calling him the tecton son or the carpenter's son, they're not scoffing at him for being a carpenter, right? Yeah, Sean.
Same thing.
Okay. All right. So this again is they're in the world of bread and circuses, and he begins to St. Paul by his example, and Christ by his redeeming sacrifice. Right? Like think about he spent 30 years working. 30 years working. Like work has been sanctified because of him, right? And so the world changes as the dignity of work changes.
I don't understand that. Like dignity of his work as a missionary or as like a tent maker?
Both. They can't be separated. Right? Both of them were his vocation.
Okay.
Right? Because what did he refuse to do? He refused to take handouts, remember? He talks about in his letter to the Corinthians, he's like, never once did I take a handout from anybody. Because he knew what it would turn him into. And so we begin to reap the fruit of Christianity, and we'll talk about in a minute why. That's why we have to keep staying there. So, all right. So Paul leaves. This is when he's in Corinth, and he's already had this horrible experience in Athens, and he goes to Corinth. And if you begin to understand the background of this, we can tend to over supernaturalize what was going on, and not think about the human element, and then have trouble applying to us. So Paul leaves Athens, and then he's in Corinth, and every Sabbath he entered into discussion in the synagogue, attempting to convince both Jews and Greeks, and those are the Greeks are the God-fearers. When Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began to occupy himself totally with preaching the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your heads. I am clear of your responsibility. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." So he left there and went to a house belonging to a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next to a synagogue. All right, so this Titus lives next to the synagogue. So Paul's realizing this synagogue approach not working. So he goes with Titus next door into his house, and begins preaching there. All right. Does everyone know what the word church really means? The word ecclesia in Greek? It's house, right? This is where it comes from. So the movement now is out of the synagogue into these small churches and small houses because the synagogue approach is not working. Yes?
Is this the Titus of later gets a letter from Paul?
Yes.
As a bishop?
Yes.
Crazy though.
So again, historically looking, so from all eternity, God planned the synagogues, and somehow Titus was inspired to buy a house beside one, so that they could grab people before they went into the synagogue. All right. Any accident there? All right.
And so
This also shows that there's a habit. I think we talked last week about the danger of what I think we call it antiquarianism, of thinking, well, we have to go back to what the early church did. If you're really going to do that, then you probably should start in synagogues, not in your house church, because that's where they started, right? So this sort of shows, okay, it wasn't really meant to. It was meant to get bigger and bigger, right? And then going back to a house church is now to cut off all the development since then. All right. So let's now begin. So now we're in sort of the house, and let's talk about the life of the family in ancient Rome. We spent a lot of time reading this last semester, so hopefully you guys know it pretty well by now. But I want to talk about just how countercultural this was, right? And guess what? Still is, right? So the Roman family was sort of centered around what's called the paterfamilias, right? The father almost as a king. All right, and everyone in the family as his servants. All right, so he had slaves, he has children, his wife, everyone. All right. So when that's the prevailing thing, when St. Paul says something like, be subordinate to your wife out of reverence for Christ, that's pretty counterculture, right? And so there's sort of this absolute dictatorship, and then the father is supposed to see himself as a servant of everyone in his household. And then he even goes so far as to say that even your slaves, you're supposed to see as brothers. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. So what was family life like in ancient Rome? Have you guys ever sort of read about family life? All right. So it was obviously very, very authoritative, sort of from the father, owned everyone in the house. Abortion was rampant. Abortion and exposure. So anyone who tells you that abortion is something new, that we've never believed that from the very beginning. They had abortions back then. They had potions they could take that would cause abortions. Obviously not as safe, but it was still an issue. Very often when the child was born, if it was a girl, they would take it down to the dump and leave her there. And then normally what someone would do is people who own slaves would go and get the child and bring it up as a slave, and usually as a prostitute. And so the Christians would go and take the children first, right? And they would raise them. Right? This is again sort of how countercultural they were. If the child had any kind of defect or anything, they just left it on the floor normally. They had this thing where when the child is born, if the father picked it up within 3 days, then he would keep it. If not, they get rid of the child. And so now, this seems absolutely brutal because we're looking at it through a Christian lens, right? Like, okay, now those children, bring the children to me. Again, think about how countercultural that is and was. And see how as you begin to move post-Christian, how we move back to that same thing. We've already been here. All right. So just to keep in mind, another reason why we study this is because we're going back in that direction. We know how to flip it around, right? We have a model for how to flip it around. All right. All right. So what else about the house? Let's talk a little bit about what the world saw of the Christians. This is it's called the letter to Diognetus. Diognetus was a tutor to Marcus Aurelius. We don't really know who the author was. They think it may have been Justin Martyr, who we'll talk about in a couple weeks. Christians are indistinguishable from other men, either by nationality, language, or customs. They do not inhabit separate cities of their own. Their teaching is not based upon reveries inspired by curiosity of men. Unlike some other people, they champion no purely human doctrine. Yet there's something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full role as citizens, but labor under all disabilities of aliens. Any country can be their homeland, but for them, their homeland, wherever it may be, is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and have children, but they don't expose them. That's the idea of getting rid of them if you don't want them. To speak in general terms, we may say that the Christian is to the world what the soul. This is the important part for us as Christians now. This is your role. To speak in general terms, we may say that the Christian is to the world what the soul is to the body, as distinct from it. So Christians, as the soul is present in every part of the body while remaining distinct from it, so Christians are found in all the cities of the world, as the visible body contains the invisible soul. So Christians are seen living in the world, but their religious life remains unseen. The body hates the soul and wars against it, not because of any injury the soul has done it, but because of the restriction the soul places on its pleasures. Right, you see the parallel he's drawing, right? Similarly, the world hates the Christians not because they have done it any wrong, but because they are opposed to its enjoyments. All right, so what is he saying? Okay, so he's describing what the Christian vocation is in the world. All right, he's just building on what Jesus, when he calls Christians leaven, what it really means. How leaven doesn't, you can't raise the dough without standing outside of it, right? To our conversation about having children in public school versus not, we can't build Catholic ghettos, right? They didn't even do it then. And it spread because they didn't do that. Yes, kind of.
Is this written in such a way as someone like describing what a Christian vocation is, or is this writing as somebody describing like this is how the world sees?
It's both, right? So understand, like, the Christian, he's saying, like, the Christian life, people hate Christians not because they're Christian, but because their lives are an indictment on their lives. Like, just looking at you, the way you live, makes me realize that I'm not living the way I should. And I can either convert or hate you for it, right? And that's just the reality. All right, so tied to this, let's talk about, again, one of the ways in which the church changed the world. So one of the sort of complaints against the church often is that they didn't do anything about slavery. It's a little absurd, right? So now we have a history to understand, like, okay, completely powerless in the world, right? So what did St. Paul do about slavery? So if you guys know, the letter of Philemon is mostly about this man named Onesimus, who was a slave, who was owned by a friend of St. Paul's named Philemon. So Philemon was this wealthy merchant in Colossae, and he had this slave who stole from him, escaped, went to Rome, spent all his money, was in trouble, remembered St. Paul from when he visited his master, and he sought St. Paul out. And this friendship develops, but St. Paul says, you have to go back. All right. So at first you go, okay, he's in slavery, why would he send him back? So clearly St. Paul is okay with slavery, right? Not really, right? So here's what he says. Therefore, although he's writing to Philemon again, I have the full right in Christ to order you to do what is proper. So what is proper? Not to have a slave, right? So Paul's saying, as your spiritual father, I can tell you got to let him go. All right? And he's very clear what's proper, right? But what does he say? I rather urge you out of love, being as I am Paul, an old man, and now also a prisoner for Christ Jesus. I urge you on behalf of my child, Onesimus, whose father I have become in my imprisonment, who was once useless to you, but is now useful to both you and me. I am sending him, that is, my own heart back to you. I should have liked to retain him for myself so that he might serve me on your behalf in my imprisonment for the gospel, but I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that the good you might do might not be forced but voluntary. So what is he saying?
He wants him to free himself.
Yeah, he wants him to choose to free him, right? Like, this is like human relations 101. Like, if you want someone to do something you want them to do, like,
give them a choice.
Sort of an impugn virtue to them. Go, like, I know you're the kind of person who would do this, and then you tell them what you want them to do, right? That's not manipulation at all. No, but he's saying, okay, here's what the proper thing. You know what the proper thing is to do, but I want you to do it freely. All right, and guess what Philemon did? He freed him. Right? And how do we know that? Because Onesimus became a bishop. All right, so he was a bishop with the stamp of slave on his head. All right. In fact, the second pope, Linus, was also a slave with the stamp of slave on his head. All right.
Wait,
Tattoo?
Yes.
Paul had a stamp on his head?
No. The second pope, Linus,
Oh, okay.
and Onesimus too has a stamp on his head because he's a slave. All right.
Paul was never.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the culture real quick, and then we can talk about why the. So 1/3 of it's obviously a slave society, right? And 1/3 of the entire empire are slaves. Now, often, so slavery was gone by the year 950 in Western Europe, pretty much all of Europe. The only places where it still remained were where the Muslims were on the Iberian Peninsula and in parts of Russia. So, yes.
What was your definition of slaves?
It doesn't matter. Chattel, even like booty from war, all that. Although, so as the Crusades sort of come, the Christians, because the Muslims will take prisoners as slaves, the Christians will sometimes do likewise. But then the popes are very clear that you can't do that. And so by the year 1000, slavery is pretty much eliminated. All right, and then it rises again with the New World. And it's because, well, what happened anyone know what happened in Spain right before Columbus sailed the ocean blue?
They took out
the
all
Reconquista?
the Muslims and joined the two.
Yeah, so Spain was liberated, but a lot of the Islamic habits remained, including slavery. All right? And so Spain begins to take slaves. First they try enslaving the Indians, but that's not working. One, because their contact with the Western Europeans, they're dying. But two, they found they don't really care. They won't work. And so now they go down in Africa, and the Muslims are willing to sell them the slaves, and they take the slaves off to the New World. So these Christians are now reintroducing slavery. But the whole time the church is speaking out against it. Okay? The whole time. So, sort of to make a long story short, the important part, and this is really where like the historical attacks have to come. Who decided slavery was wrong?
Christians.
Christians, right? So when you say the Christians had slaves and you try to attack the church with it, what are you really saying?
Christian sin.
Christian sin, which is what we say all the time, right? Oh wait, we don't live up to the teachings of the church? Because you can't take Christian principles and attack the church with them because the church gave you the Christian principles. All right, this is across the board. All right, and it's a common thing. All right, I'm going to try to start flying a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about St. Paul's martyrdom. St. Paul returns to Rome a second time, so he's there the first time, he's released, goes off on further journeys, probably to Spain, comes back to Rome again during the reign of Nero. He and Peter are captured and both martyred on the same day. Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, is martyred outside the city, which is where the church of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome is. He's beheaded where Peter was crucified upside down. Let's see if there's anything else we sort of... okay, so let's just talk about persecutions in general. So persecutions from 67 AD till 312 AD, all right? Because Christianity is illegal. But the Romans had a thing. If they wanted to squash a religion, remember we talked about religion, they didn't like a religion, what would they do? Since they were just local. They'd burn the temple and kill the priests. And then their religion would disappear, right? So what do they do with the Christians?
They kill the priests and burn them.
Yeah, they go for the bishops and the leaders, right? And they leave most of the people alone. So most people in the Roman Empire that were Christians were pretty much left alone. It was the leaders that they always went after because that was their MO. That's the way they worked. And there's times where it's much worse, and times where it's not bad at all, depending on sort of what the emperor wants to do. And all total during that time, there's probably about 1,000 martyrs that we know of. I'm sure there's more than that. But if you're looking like the role of martyrdom, it's 1,000. Let's talk about martyrdom very quickly. Pope Benedict defines it as the voluntary ending, enduring, or tolerating of death on account of the faith of Christ, or another act of virtue in reference to God. Based on three. So this is just for us to understand martyrdom. All right. The martyrs of the past and those of our time gave and give life freely and consciously in a supreme act of love, witnessing to their faithfulness to Christ, to the gospel, and to the church. All right. So it has to. The first is to sort of understand that the word martyr means witness. And so it has to be. It can't just be that you're a Christian and you get killed. You have to be in some way witnessing to the faith. All right, and we'll talk about why there's like these rules, because it doesn't mean that just because someone dies and they're not a martyr that don't become a saint. The second, remember that. So what's the goal then? Like when a person is martyred. Is it to die for the faith, or is it to witness?
To witness.
Yeah, because otherwise, if they die for the faith, it's called suicide, right? So the goal is witness, right? So St. John the Evangelist is considered a martyr, even though he died of natural causes, because he suffered what should have killed him, but miraculously he didn't die. Right? He was thrown into a vat of oil as a witness. All right. So death is usually part of it, but not always. So the end is you're not just dying for a cause, you're witnessing to, and not just witnessing to your belief, but witnessing to something really, really the whole purpose of it. I'm witnessing to the fact that Christ has conquered death. I don't care about death. Right? That's what makes Christians a puzzle. Right? Everyone is scared of death, except the Christians are like, why are these people not scared? And that's it. It's to witness to the power of the resurrection, right? Because, like St. Paul says, without the resurrection, our faith is in vain. It's not as if that was Jesus' credibility. It was the fact that when they go to Peter and go, yeah, we're going to crucify you. He's like, that's fine. My friend, he conquered death. I watched him. He died. Then he was with us 3 days later. Anything you do, you can't touch me. Right? That's faith in the power of the resurrection. Right? Death has death, where is your sting? Right? That's the idea. All right. Second is, of course, necessary to find irrefutable proof of readiness for martyrdom. That is, you can't fight back. So
it can't be a surprise either.
Yeah, like it has to be an act of the will, consent. And then the third is that the person actually has to hate the faith and try to fight you. All right. So all that being said, so martyrdom is a gift from God, not something we should go looking for. You guys know the story of St. Francis. He went looking for it and didn't find it. In fact, he ended up making a friend. So he goes to the Sultan, and he's like, oh, this is a great... The Sultan's near. Let me go talk to him, and he'll kill me, and I'll be a martyr. And he goes, and the Sultan loves him. He gives this poor guy who hates stuff a lot of stuff. He's like, come on, seriously? And he learns this. He's like, okay, I can't plan martyrdom. Right? So it's a gift. But why is this true? Why is this true? What are you witnessing to, though?
Well, I mean, first off, a grain of wheat that does not fall will bear no fruit, and a grain of wheat that dies will multiply.
Yeah, why, though? Why is that? Why does... So the church grows at like 40% per decade for the first 300 years. Right? And a lot of them are Roman soldiers because of martyrdom. Why? What is so powerful about it?
If we're in a culture where, like, I don't even take my God to the next town over because there's a temple there, I'm just going to start worshiping there. Like, they're clearly apathetic. They don't care. But, like, if you see someone who, like, is willing to give up what you would consider the, like, most important thing ever, like, your life for God, like, clearly, like, there's something more to that. Like, there's something different.
Yeah, so the question of why would you do, like, especially when they have these like, young girls, like 13, 14 years old, and they're like, what in the world? Like, we have men, like, whimpering going to here, and these young girls are just walking with their heads high. But remember the part about it being a gift, because this is really important. All right, it's not the fact that they die nobly. People do that all the time. It's the way in which they die, and they die. God preserves them from pain, right? Because Christ already suffered the pain. Like all the martyrs, they're standing in fire. St. Lawrence is getting roasted, and he's joking about it. That's not because he has a high pain threshold. All right, it's because God is witnessing to the fact of the truth of what St. Lawrence has said all along.
Wait, did he, the guy who, like, got put in an oven, did he not feel pain?
No.
Wait, what?
It's not like all martyrs don't feel pain.
No, I wouldn't say, but I mean, it depends on, okay, I don't want to be like, say, it doesn't, okay, but the depth of the pain they should feel is gone.
But it's not a lot easier to witness to the faith if you don't feel pain?
Because God's doing it, right? They're like, okay, why is this guy on a oven rack and not absolutely screaming? And they're like, okay, that's not human. That has to be divine. Like, that's the point about being a gift, right? It's all about God. It has nothing to do with that person. Right? That's why you can't go seeking it out. It's because God gives it to you to witness to the fact of His power. So the witness of not fearing it is one thing, but the actual witness during it, right? Like when we talk about St. Ignatius, right? When he says he wants to be the bread of God, and they're frying him and he smells like bread. Like, how do you answer that, right? Like, and he's perfectly, like, he's just standing there. Right? And you hear all these stories of, like, people having, like, axes in their head, walking around. God can, like, and you see now, like, going back to close the loop on what we talked about at the beginning about 11 deaths, right?
Or
Like
something
that's Satan's way of mimicking the martyrs. That's all that is.
Wait, what are you talking about?
Rasputin's 11 deaths.
Oh.
It's just Satan's way of mimicking what God does. Right? And he's trying to make it seem like, oh, well, see, look what's happened.
If you look up pictures of the guy, like, something's wrong.
Rasputin?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, Connor.
So going back, is it that they didn't feel pain, or more is in the sense of like God gave them the grace to find like joy and in that suffering and uniting that to Christ?
I would say that no one without a special grace could endure being roasted on a spigot, like on a whatever you call it, a spigot, on a
Something.
yeah, whatever the thing is you're roasted on. Yeah, spit. Thank you. A gridiron, whatever. Like no human could endure that. That's what I mean. That's the whole point, right? Like they have to look at it and go, no human being could do that. Like, because if they did, they could just go, well, that guy was pretty tough. Like that's so. Do they feel no pain? I don't know. Like, but do they not feel the pain they should? Absolutely, because that would be enough to kill anyone. And the fact that they're not dead, the fact that St. John was thrown in a vat of oil and doesn't die, the fact that St. Maximilian Kolbe was in a starvation chamber for 15 days and he's singing psalms, annoying everyone. Like you go, okay, hold on a second. Like that is not humanly like it's to get to the point to go, that's not humanly possible. Therefore, it must be God. That's the witness. Like that's all it is. And then you see like St. Maximilian Kolbe, he does all that and they inject him with something and he dies immediately. Because he's done it, the witness is over. He's done. Right? He's won his prize. So that's the point. So I don't want to give the impression they feel no pain. I don't know. But I would say that the amount of pain they feel is not proportional to what they're receiving at all. All right, does that make sense? Like, and the reason why I spend so much time on that, like, that's just spur us on a little bit. Like, have no fear. Yeah. Realistically, right? Have no, like, how many saints stories do we have like that?
Okay.
Right?
Oh, God.
Yeah, and it's not just this really cool. It's like God acts, faithfulness. God acts. Right? That's the whole purpose of studying these things. Like, it's not, if you go look at it just as this sort of curiosity of history, you're going to go, oh, that's kind of cool. I wonder how they did that. Let's study that. Like, no, they did it because they loved God and made themselves available to Him, and they had no fear of death. All right, questions. So I spent way too much time on that history part, and I probably should have just. Hopefully, it was helpful though. Yes.
What's your Bible translation?